slides already?
Maybe in a moment. I'll just say a quick welcome and then we can get going. So welcome to our 123rd Betting Online Sports Economics Seminar, where we are going head-to-head with in-person economics conferences, sports economics conferences in the US. So thank you everyone who is here. It's good to see a good number of folk. And we have today Mario Lackner presenting with a slightly different title from what was previously advertised. And so the title is Gender Effort in Competition, the Role of Observed Performance. Mario, you know the format. You've got an hour sort of talking and plenty of time for Q&A. So without any further ado, please do take away your talk.
All right. So all right. So I hope everyone can see my slides and it works out pretty fine. So welcome everybody from my side also. First, before I start, I want to really thank you for giving me the opportunity to change my topic so late before this presentation, but I thought that these new results might be perfectly suited for this kind of format and to present this for the first time basically at an audience that is probably best suited for this kind of topic and this kind of research piece. So the topic today, or what I will present today, is joint work with various team co-authors of mine, René Böheim from the same university, and recently joined by Bastian Westbrook, who is from the University of Hamburg. And together we decided to use a fancy new data set that we collected and set up and investigate how effort in competitions is related to gender and performances that are actually observed. So I'm sitting in front of a single screen today. So if there are any questions, problems, if I'm too quick or not understandable in any instance, then just interrupt me. That's absolutely fine with me. So in a nutshell, what we are doing today, or what we kind of want to answer here, is the question if a courtside audience in professional tennis does actually affect the performance of female and male players differently. So what we are doing is we are looking at data from Grand Slam tournaments from 2016 to 2021. And we found ourselves a nice field experiment that's in this data. And what we want to do with this data is look at these point level observations and investigate whether there are some certain patterns in effort related to whether there is an attendance courtside or not, and whether these patterns are actually different for female or male players. The natural experiment we are exploiting here is, or actually two separate ones, two lockdowns that took place in the second half of 2020, as well as a lockdown in early 2021 for two Grand Slam tournaments that were somewhat different in nature, but really did the same trick to what we would expect in terms of the outcome. So we have somewhat different treatment intensities in the sense that these lockdowns are different in nature concerning what we actually would observe and expect in the end. But we see that what we find actually nicely fits what we would expect in terms of how intense the treatment actually was. In our sense, basically, was there anyone allowed into these courts, or was it really a zero attendance restriction? So in the end, and that's just a peek ahead, we find robust evidence on a sizable gender gap in how these professional players react to whether a crowd is present or not. And we do some robustness checks and find this actually to be quite robust. So we hope to contribute to many, many different strands of the literature, where first we kind of think that it is important to understand why performances should even be affected by being observed, in the sense that if performances are actually publicly observable, then we could expect that there is different behavior for men and women, because there might be different gender-related norms. And this has already been speculated in some contributions quite a long time ago, that we could expect women and men to react differently when performance is actually monitored or observed. So there are some previous results out there that either find no effect of observability, that find some effect, that find effect going in one direction, while others contest this effect. There's just a recent publication out there that doesn't really find too much here in the sense of a gender gap in competitiveness. We think this is relevant for many, many settings outside of sports. For example, we found a literature that is speculating that male or female politicians may react differently when they are actually observed. Being observed meaning that their meetings or their discussions are actually broadcasted on TV. So what political scientists find is typically that politicians care more or less when they are either observed or not. So they could give more effort by giving better speeches, not looking at the smartphones during speeches and stuff like that. Obviously, we could also contribute to how employees who participate in any sort of competitive environment would adjust their effort when they are observed or monitored. We could look at firms, whether it's competition between firms or whether it's competition within firms. And we could see that whenever you monitor how much effort somebody is putting forward, or how actually productivity changes over time or in different settings, this might be relevant to analyze for female and male participants differently. So in the literature, there are some results that indicate that there might be a difference whether some shops have more or less women on their staffs, but it's not really focused on separately female or male competitors. So there's also a growing literature that is not really that developed, but I think it will develop quite a bit in the future. That's looking at performance when you are working remote. So there are two papers out there. One is actually looking at data from IT firms, and they find that working remote is completely different than working in office. And productivity is affected by how closely you are monitored and how often you actually talk to a supervisor or stuff like that. And the other paper is using sports data. It's looking at professional chess players. And what they find is that all those online remote tournaments are completely different to tournaments that are on stage. And some players find it really difficult to compete remotely. So that is somehow the literature we are trying to contribute to. And in our analysis, we consider mainly a positive or a negative effect of a crowd. So this has been speculated before, that whenever you have a crowd present, you have some sort of effort creating mechanism, because whenever you compete and you know that you are being observed, you would shy away from reducing effort to a non-maximum level, because that might in the end have negative consequences for your career or just a competition. So there's quite some literature out there, and it's still growing on how a crowd should actually affect competitions. So there is some literature out there looking at how competing in a friendly home environment actually affects your chances of winning. So this has started long before the pandemic, but recent contributions nicely exploit the natural experiment nature of the lockdowns to kind of demonstrate that this has actually had some effect. Other contributions look at how referees were affected, so looking more at the channel, perhaps, and identifying that referee decisions maybe are affected by whether there is a crowd to begin with and how big the crowd is or how friendly the crowd actually is. So there is a number of contributions who look directly at the extensive and intensive margin of crowd effects on performances. So like whether there is choking under pressure affected by the type of crowd or by the size of crowd. There's also some literature out there that's looking at how performances are affected, so the margin of victory and stuff like that. But from a gender perspective, the evidence is actually quite scarce because there is not really too much evidence out there whether male or female competitors on the same competitive level basically are affected differently. So we think we can contribute something to this. And the way we approach this is looking at this in a more formal way by having a model. And I will not go through the model today, but just give you an intuition what's behind this. So in the end, we look at a payoff that you get from competing, and you have two values, whether you actually win the current stage of your competition or whether you actually lose the current stage of the competition. So losing means in a dynamic contest that you continue to fight in the next stage. And in tennis matches, the data we are going to use in just a few slides, losing basically means that you lose the set and you continue to the next set. So you know that in Grand Slam tournaments, you have to win 3 sets if you are a male player, you have to win 2 sets if you're a female player. So you have continuation value if you win the set, and you have a continuation value if you lose a set. And you allocate your effort considering your effort cost, and you consider how much is your continuation value when winning the set or when losing the set. And here comes the crowd effect into play, where we assume that when you are winning a set, you have a positive crowd effect in the sense that you get some extra reward by being celebrated or by being cheered at, or you lose the set and you get some negative effect by getting some negative feedback, by experiencing that your opponent gets cheered and stuff like that. So this is just the outline. And from this model setup, we draw some equilibrium conditions and get one hypothesis that we can actually test empirically. And this hypothesis is basically that in a setting with 2 comparably strong players, this model would expect that the player who is behind decreases effort in the absence of a crowd. And the intuition behind this is basically that the crowd is a very special actor in our setting in the sense that they get utility from observing an exciting and competitive match. So you would not go to a tennis match if you would not expect to see a competitive match there, at least not if you are not the fan of one of the players competing. So the players will actually give maximum effort in order to show that they are competitive, because if they are not, and if they deviate from maximum effort, then this will actually result in a situation where the utility of the crowd decreases, and in a sense they get a lower quality product, and this will in the end reduce the value or how they see this player, whether it's male or female, and in the end this will have negative or can have negative consequences for the player. So to test this hypothesis, we collected data from Jeff Sackman's data archive, which consists of shot log data. And shot log data is a very specific data on tennis because this is actually manually coded data. So the way it works, for those of you who are not familiar with this data, people actually watch these matches, and during watching, they code each and every point. So in the data, we know exactly who coded this match, and we know exactly what happens during each and every point along all the sets that were played, along all the games that were played. And we know also, in addition to the outcome that's in the official scores, we know, for example, how long each point was played, how many strokes. We have some indications in there how the point was decided, for example, whether there was a mistake or not. And in the end, we can use this data to test our hypothesis. Because we're using a natural experiment that is outlined here, so what I have here in these data points is all the Grand Slam tournaments as indicated below on the x-axis. So we're using the Australian Open and the US Open starting from 2016. And you see those dots and you see those triangles for female and male competitions. And what is illustrated here is the rally duration for each point on average in these tournaments or in the matches that are actually coded for these tournaments. And what you see is that this stayed fairly flat. And then we have two very, very meaningful events. First of all, we had the bubble for the 2020 US Open. I will say something about this in a minute. And our second experiment we're looking at is the lockdown for the Australian Open in 2021. So this is what we are starting with. And we are exploiting two lockdowns here and compare it actually with a third lockdown. So the first lockdown, which is actually the best experiment we have here in the data, is the 2021 Australian Open lockdown. And this was such a nice event because it actually was completely unexpected, in the sense that the Australian Open were prepared to go ahead with a reduced but still sizable crowd. So the tickets for these Grand Slam tournaments are always sold per session. So in a sense, you get the ticket, and in addition to being allowed to the venue, you have to buy a second ticket in order to get to one of the main courts there. So they had a reduced crowd, but it was still large enough to consider it a crowd where you would not necessarily expect a difference, so to speak. But during the tournament on February 12th, the state of Victoria actually ordered a strict stay-at-home order, and all the matches between 13 and 17, actually this should say February, sorry, were played without an attendance. No, it's wrong here as well, so sorry. So we had 5 days, or almost 5 days, where nobody was actually allowed to enter the venue. So this is a very nice natural experiment in the sense that nobody actually expected this. And it did not happen because there were any cases related to the tournament. So this was actually far away from the tournament. It was a statewide lockdown, and this measure was certainly not expected. And if you were a player, you couldn't do anything about it because you couldn't even leave. The attendances were allowed to come back at a very strictly reduced number, but this was only for the semifinals and the final. And it was about 7,500 per session. So it was reduced, but still people were on court back again. So the second experiment we're looking at was the US Open bubble in 2020. It was different in the sense that at the beginning of the year in 2020, nobody really knew whether the tournament would go ahead or not. But during summer, when the pandemic kind of slowed down and everybody was forgetting that it was still there, basically, the state of New York was in actually considering whether they should allow to have some capacity there on courts. But in the end, it was similar to the Australian Open in the sense that no attendances were allowed, but there was one thing that they actually did allow, and that was coaches and whoever was there with the players were allowed to watch courtside. So we had some people present, but it was certainly not comparable to any sort of crowd or whatever. And this was only in the main courts. It was not on the smaller courts. So you had basically 3 courts in this tournament where you could expect to have a maximum of like 200 or so spectators. For both lockdowns, we had some players that did not attend. So you probably have heard of some cases that were not there. But if we look at the descriptive statistics later on, the matches we are actually observing are not really that much different in terms of their characteristics than the other match we have in the control group. And we have a placebo treatment, which we can nicely exploit, which is the 2020 French Open. So we do not use them for our main analysis, just for the fact that they were postponed from May, early June to September. But the nice thing about the French Open is that although played at a completely different point of time during the year, this tournament was actually played in front of a crowd that was certainly not zero. It was nowhere near the maximum capacity, but there were spectators present. And if you watched just one of these matches on the main courts, then it wasn't really anywhere close to a lockdown match. So people were cheering. There were actually there was quite some noise there. So it was completely different to what players expected or experienced during the Australian Open and the US Open in that period. So looking at pretends here a bit, we can look at the probability of a trailing player who is trailing by 2 or more games, or by at least more than 2, I have to say, games for the Australian Open and the US Open. And in the left panel here, you actually see WTA, so women's matches. And on the right panel here, you see men's matches. And the probability is somewhat comparable. It's slightly higher for men, but it's really not statistically significantly different. But we don't see any sort of pre-trends that might worry us. So we see that under normal conditions, these 2 tournaments were similarly competitive over time. So this is encouraging that we can use these tournaments as a control group to have them as tournaments where the level of competition is comparable to those 2 treated tournaments, but the crowd was present. Everything else should have been the same. We're not using any tournaments after the lockdown tournaments, because then someone could speculate that these tournaments were also treated in the sense that you already experienced the pandemic, and certainly the careers of those players might have been affected in one way or the other. So we could expect that a player who was on the fringe of being really a professional player and earning enough to have a living there, to have been affected differently than a player who is in the top 10 and who should not expect too many negative consequences from the pandemic. So our empirical approach will look basically like a diff and diff model, where we have some sort of outcome variable, which will mainly be a binary variable indicating whether the trailing player actually wins or not. And winning always means whether she or he wins the point. We have an indicator whether this is a men's match. We have an indicator whether it was treated, so if a lockdown was actually in place during that time. And the interaction should give us the causal effect of audience presence on performance if we control for whatever we can observe, which is basically characteristics of a point, of a game, or set. So we have everything we can test about the set score, who is actually on serve. We have the number of points that was played before. We have the average duration of the last 10 points and stuff like that. So we can control for quite a lot in our data. So looking at the data a little bit in terms of our outcome variables, we can see that we do not really see many differences in terms of women and men or between lockdown or no lockdown conditions. So just the descriptives do not show anything that should concern us in terms of whether men and women are really that different in terms of their level of competitiveness. So we have a series of outcome variables here. First of all, we have a binary variable whether the trailing player wins the point. And trailing does always mean that the gap in terms of the intermediate game score is at least 3 or higher. We have rally duration as a simple outcome variable. So this is measured in strokes, where 0 strokes would mean that it is decided by the serve. We have a binary variable doing the same trick, basically. We have a variable indicating whether the outcome or the point was decided by a mistake. We have an outcome that indicates whether the point was decided on serve, whether it's won by the server with an ace, lost by the server with a double fault, or whether it was some mistake by the returning player. We have a variable that should indicate whether risk-taking was involved, and I will talk about this in a minute. And we have an indicator whether the player who is leading actually quickly wins the point without it being a mistake on serve. So these are our control variables. Not going to go through these in detail. Nothing really that would concern us in terms of what we would probably find problematic in terms of comparing men and women here. The only thing is that those matches that are treated and the number of points there is comparably small. So it's just around 15% of all the points played we observe that are actually under lockdown conditions. But I will show you that the choice of our basically control group is not responsible for what we actually get in terms of results. And here I am already at our main results. So this is really fresh off the bat. So if we look at all scores, meaning that all the points that are played in these matches that we are able to observe in the data, we don't see any effect of the crowd. So this is what our model would tell us. So if no player is actually behind, and if we take all the points that we can observe in the data, then we don't see any effect. If we restrict our sample, however, to those points where one of the players is actually trailing by 3 or more games, then we see that we have a significant and quite substantial effect, meaning that the probability that the trailing player wins the point decreases by something around 9-10 percentage points. And this is quite significant because if you look at the mean, it's slightly below 50-50. So this means something if such an effect actually occurs. So we see that there is no general effect, but this effect only appears to be present for male players. We find this for estimating the model with all the control variables, but since we have a natural experiment, something which should be random by nature, we can look at this without all the control variables and we get around the same estimate here. So this is already our main result. So we think it's worthwhile to look a little bit deeper where this effect is actually coming from. And if we look at the tournaments separately, the Australian Open and the US Open, we see that the effect is biggest probably for the Australian Open. And this should be expected because the lockdown was strictest and completely unexpected. So everybody who was under these conditions at the Australian Open in 2021 expected to be playing in front of almost a full crowd. At the US Open, the effect is still significant at the 10% level. It's quantitatively smaller. It's not really precisely estimated, so I wouldn't go really that far to say that it is smaller, but it's certainly less pronounced. And if we now include also the French Open in 2020, which was, by the way, just 1 or 2 weeks apart from the US Open, we see that there's absolutely no effect. So we see there is a zero that we are estimating, and it's nowhere close to being statistically significant. This is kind of encouraging that escalating our lockdown scenario, like from right to left here, we also see that the effect is actually increasing. If we go further and we look at different channels, we look at rally duration, and what we find is that it takes about 0.6 strokes less to actually decide points for men's matches under lockdowns, where one of these players is trailing by 3 or more games. And we actually see some indication of a slight positive effect in general. So that would be the effect on female players. So we see that these points are shorter for male players due to the absence of the crowd. We see the same result here for the binary indicator. We see that there is a slightly higher probability that the point gets decided by a mistake. So there is this coding in the data whether we have an unforced error or not. And this indicator here measures the effect on this outcome. The probability that the point is decided on serve is reduced. And we don't see anything in terms of our risk-taking measure, but the probability that the leading player wins quickly in less than 4 strokes increases. So from this, we can take that the channel really could be effort, and we don't see any indication that risk-taking might involve. Because you could see, for example, that you're not decreasing risk, but you're not decreasing effort, but you are increasing risk because no one is present and no one can actually give you negative cheers if you just don't care and risk as much as possible. But that does not seem to be the case from these results, at least. So if we further want to understand whether really risk-taking does play a role, and it's always difficult to separate effort from risk-taking, we augmented our data that we used for the first results by a second data set, also from Jeff Sackman, that includes serve speeds. So there's the result in the literature out there that whenever you have a competitive situation, when you have a disadvantage in terms of the intermediate outcome, you might increase risk-taking in order to stay in the competition. And this result is really robust and well developed, but we do not really know whether this is actually true for female and male competitors. We only know that there is probably a gender gap in risk-taking. So this might play a role in our results that I showed you before. So now we look at 3 different outcomes that might be the best indicators of risk that we have in tennis. So the first indicator is speed on second serve. So what I have here is the data, all the matches we had in the first data set merged with the second data set, but using now a different outcome variable. So we have a subset of overlapping matches where we can actually look at the serve speed on first and second serve. And we see that the second serve speed is not affected here when no crowd is present and one of the players is trailing. So this is the first indicator that risk-taking seems to play no role here in our results. The probability if the first serve is in or out is not affected significantly, and the number of double faults is also not driven here by the crowd. So in the end, this even strengthens our argument that it is really effort which is doing the trick and not risk-taking. Going further, you might think that the threshold we have here now with our 3 games or more might be somewhat arbitrary. Well, I would argue in the end that it is not arbitrary, in the sense that if you are trailing by 3 or more games, then you have at least a deficit of 1 break. It might be 2, it might be 1. That's why it's important to control actually for who is serving, whether the trailing player or the one who is ahead. But in the end, this is certainly a sizable gap, because if you're trailing by 2 breaks, then your chances of still winning the set are basically 0. You don't really see that often. So we just wanted to look at whether our results are really driven by choosing this threshold. And we say that first we look at points that are played in games where the deficit in terms of games is only 1 game. Then 2 games, 3 games, and even 4 games. And you see that our estimate here increases in magnitude. I would not really consider this sample here too much, because the sample size is really, really low. But that the estimate increases and the precision increases is a good indicator for the fact that what we are looking is actually exactly that the lower your chances of still winning are, the higher is your tendency to reduce effort if nobody looks on and nobody actually considers your effort. We have some effect heterogeneity. The first one is match quality. If you have a top match, you would expect that whoever is competing should not really care about the crowd, but you still get effort incentives by playing against a strong opponent, because you could expect that fans, when they watch on TV or read the newspaper, whatever, will actually consider your effort, because they will observe your match somehow. We also look at the size of the court, whether it's an arena court or whether it's one of the smaller courts. In arena courts, you could easily expect that your match will be televised. If you're playing on a smaller court, in these tournaments where the lockdowns are actually observed, we would have static cameras that are not really movable. So the probability that a substantial crowd watches your match is really, really low. So you should basically be playing without someone watching, even on TV or in the internet. We also look at whether it's a key point or not. And finally, we also look at whether you actually have a potential to concede a set, meaning if you're already trailing by 2 sets in a men's match, you have no room to concede a set, but then you will concede the match. And we certainly would not expect that there are incentives to concede a Grand Slam match, because the incentives are really, really high, whether it's financial incentives or whether it's ranking points you get there. You would never give up a Grand Slam match if you are completely healthy and you actually want to compete. So looking at this effect heterogeneity, we find that our effect only appears in matches that are not top matches, so where not both players are not from the top 50. We see that in arena courts, the effect is 0. It's only present at those minor courts. It's difficult to disentangle these 2 effects. I will talk about that on the next slide. The importance of the point plays a role. If it's not a key point, then we see the effect. So people only reduce effort in the absence of a crowd if it's not a key point. And if they actually can concede a set, if they cannot lose the set without losing the match, we don't see any effect. So I talked about whether it's actually the court size and the probability of being live on TV does the trick, or whether it's the quality of the match if you're playing against a well-known opponent and you're visible because of this. So we look at a different definition of whether it's a good game or not by looking only at matches where the combined WTA or ATP rank is larger than 40. So we see almost the same effect as for the complete sample here. And if we look separately on the same definition here, combined with the fact that this match is played at one of the arena courts, so the biggest court, the second biggest court, or the grandstand, then we see that the effect completely disappears. So the sample size is smaller here, but we should still have enough power to estimate a significant effect. The only difference might be that we have somewhat more competitive matches in here, but if we really match the match characteristics here in our third column, then we still get an effect which is almost identical to the one we have here in the unrestricted sample. So it really seems to be the court which is doing the trick. So some robustness checks. If we look at ranking differences that are smaller than 100, so remember from the theoretical model, we had the condition that if two comparable players compete, so we have to reduce the ability difference somewhat to show that the effect is still there. So if we reduce this to 100 or smaller, meaning that like the first ranked player could still play the 100 ranked player, and these players might still be somewhat comparable in the sense that it's always possible for a lower ranked player to beat the higher ranked player. We still get the effect. If we look at the second through seventh round, we still get the same effect. If we reduce the time period looking only at years 2018 and later, we still get the same effect. And if we look only at points where the ball was in play, meaning that it was not won by serve, then we see the same effect as well. So not affected by any of these potential biases in our data. We also randomly select points from all the tournaments in our control group. So just drawing 1/4 of all points randomly and run 500 regressions using this different control group. And what we get is here on average, basically what we have in our main result, and only a very, very small fraction of estimates is insignificant. Most of them probably still significant at the 10% level. So that's quite encouraging as well, that not our control group is driving our results. So I'm already finished. So to sum up, we estimate a significant gender gap in the reaction to being observed by a crowd. So we find that male players actually decrease effort when they are facing a potentially decisive gap in terms of the intermediate score. So whenever they think they cannot win anymore in this set, they decrease effort and to live another day, and probably move on to the next set and compete there with full effort again. We don't find any reaction for women. The only exception was that their rally duration is probably slightly higher during lockdowns. We don't have an explanation for that, but certainly it does not affect the probability of the trailing player to win. Our estimates are robust. We have found no indication that anything we do with the data or with our estimation process is affecting the results. And the mechanism we identify is less effort. It could be effort in terms of concentration. It might not just be physical effort, whether you run or not. It could also be that you have lesser focus or less motivation or whatever. But it seems to be unrelated to risk taking. So it's not just, okay, I decrease effort and substitute by increasing risk. It seems to be more the effort doing the trick and not risk taking. And that's encouraging because we know that there might be a gender gap in risk taking, but what we find here, our main result, seems not to be related to that. Okay, that's it. I have no thank you slide, sorry. It's just a new presentation. But thank you very much again for the opportunity, and I'm certainly looking forward to your comments or criticism. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mario. Yeah, I saw one Teams applause. We can still do that while we're on virtual meetings, so I'll do some Teams applause as well. Really interesting talk, Mario. And there's already 2 hands up. It looks like it was Daniele first, so go ahead, Daniele.
Hi, very interesting presentation. I'm a big fan of papers on tennis, having written one. So I think that one of the issues that come up in working with tennis data, that it's 2 players always play against each other. Okay, yeah. So you're looking at it from the point of view of the trailing player. Other papers have looked at the point of view of the server. But there's always what the other guy is doing. Okay, so an equivalent interpretation of your results could be that it's not that the trailing player is putting less effort when there is no crowd, but that the leading player, when there is a crowd, has the opposite effect. Like I think that those results, or those 2 conclusions are they're isomorphic, right? That in a sense they're sort of choking by male players when they're leading and in the presence of the crowd. I not 100% sure that's correct, but I would like to check that. And other than that, yeah, no, I think that's it. I may have some further questions coming up later, but great presentation.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you're pointing in a direction that's always sort of problematic, and if you look at these potential different effects on where you are in terms of your positioning in the intermediate score. I've been a bit quick on that when I went through the theoretical foundations, but what we actually get from our model, if we look at these potential efforts that you put in, depending on your continuation values, then our model tells us basically that it would not make sense that there should actually be a negative effect in terms of the leading player. I agree. We cannot rule out choking under pressure, and probably we should look at this. Yeah, but from the theoretical standpoint, it would not make sense, because that would not be an equilibrium to have the leading player reduce in the presence of a crowd the effort.
But if they're choking under pressure, they're in a sense behaving irrationally. So it could be that there's that violation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But anyway, it's interesting that you can link that to the theoretical model.
Yeah.
Thanks, Daniele. Ian has his hand up.
Hi. So I don't know how much your setup takes care of this, but so men obviously they have 5 sets in a game and women have 3. So are there more opportunities for men to adjust their effort in response to being down a set, whereas there are far fewer, and it's the male victory is further away? So could they be discounting the future or something like that?
That's an excellent comment, in the sense that we have institutional differences in terms of how dynamic these competitions actually are. So the dynamics are different in the sense that we have best of 5 and best of 3 contests. I've been very quick on this, but what is kind of supporting our notion is, if we look at the heterogeneous effects here, and we have the situation where you actually can lose a set, then we define this as neutral as possible. So we are trying to look at sets where you have an equal number of sets actually to give, in order to still be at a continuation value of losing the current set and still be in competition. So the fact that we get the result here for these situations where you can actually lose the set is an indication that it is not the different durations of the matches that actually is doing the trick here. But yeah, this is a point we have to emphasize, certainly, because it's always difficult to equalize sort of these matches, because what you would have to do is like control for. So even if you are in the men's matches and you are in the 5th set, the match could have gone quite quickly, and you could have played the same number of points as a women's match that's in the 3rd set. But we can control for the number of points and the rally durations before the observed point. So that kind of takes care of the past in a little bit. But we also have to equalize these matches in terms of how much is in the future still potential to give away sets. Yeah, that's a good comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Couldn't you look at non-Grand Slam tournaments when both men and women have just 3-set matches, Mario? Does the data exist on a point-by-point basis for those tournaments?
It does to an extent that does not really help us. So we have some matches that are coded actually, but the problem is that, which was surprising for me actually, that the number of tournaments that experienced the complete lockdown was really, really small. And if you then need the overlap with those matches that are coded, you basically end up with a handful of matches per gender, and that's not enough to do anything. But
I guess
that would be the best idea, yeah.
A quick related point, I guess, is did doubles and mixed doubles tournaments take place in these Grand Slams?
They did, but they are not coded.
Oh,
So,
okay.
I mean, they like take 10 to 15 random matches. It's
Right.
at least it seems to be random to me, because it must be people that are to some extent affiliated with one of the players, because otherwise you would not sit in front of your laptop for 4 hours and code each and every point. So
Yeah.
it's a strange selection, but it's still kind of the same over time. But
Yeah,
it's not perfect.
Okay, I've just jumped in front of Daniel. He's got his hand up with possibly some more questions.
Yeah, so actually I wanted to follow. I also thought, why not look at sort of, 3-set matches for men to sort of address that issue. It's slightly different, but could you restrict attention to your tournaments to male matches that are 1-1 after the first 2 sets? So the continuation is like a 3-set match for women. Now, of course, they have played 2 sets before, and that affects sort of, how, fit and how tired you are. But maybe that would be an interesting comparison to do. Is that, do you still see that effect in that,
Yeah, I mean, what we kind of do here is not that far away from what you are suggesting. The only difference is that it's not really matches that have been 1-1, because we considered this, and at first we thought this might be a good approach, but in the end we thought that these matches that have been 1-1 are putting a very strong restriction on the sample. So you have actually matches where both players kind of were equally good at the beginning of the match, and this kind of could really mess up what you're actually looking at, because it interferes with other dimensions that we are looking. So for example, if you have a very lopsided matchup and it's 1-1 at a particular point, this could indicate, for example, that the favored player is experiencing some difficulties and stuff like that. So I'm not sure if such a restriction is actually too easy to do without getting other problems that might be even more severe. What we do here is to look at matches where or sets basically where male players as well as female players can, for example, still lose this one set and still be in competition. This is basically what we do here, without going further into detail here. So we equalize the potential to still give up sets and made that equal for men and women. But yeah, 1-1 could also.
Any more questions and comments? One comment I've got actually, Mario, is it reminds me a little bit of a paper I wrote years ago on home advantage, where we hypothesized that home advantage in England in football fell once television became much more of a factor.
Yeah.
And then away players were being observed by the home fans when playing away, whereas before television they weren't being observed by the home fans, so they could shirk off and lose more games. I'll send you the link in case you're interested in.
Yeah, that's nice, because that's exactly the channel we have in mind. Because I mean, this is kind of a very nice relationship between the consumer or the fan who is in courtside or in the stadium, whether it's tennis or football, because you actually benefit from these guys competing. And I mean, the ATP and WTA actually have a rule against this, because if you do not give full effort, they will penalize you. I mean, given that they haven't done that much, but like Bernard Tomic, for example, has received multiple penalties for exactly that. So they know this issue.
Yeah. Daniele.
Yes. So I can't remember. So you have, one of your outcome variables was unforced errors.
Yeah.
So here is another possible measure of effort. The way that these, points are usually coded, there are winners, there are outright winners, and there are forced errors, right? And suppose that I'm really sort of not putting in that much effort, that's a hard to reach ball, I'll just give up on it, okay? So that's going to be a winner by the other player. Okay, yeah. But if it's an important point and I really need to, win it, I'm going to really make an effort, to get to the ball. I won't be able to hit it back, but at least I put my racket on it. That will be coded as a forced error, which, to me, from the point of view, and in my paper, I said, look, you should just treat the outright winner and a shot that induces a forced error as identical. But there could be some interesting variation. The proportion of winning shots, which is an outright winner and a shot that induces a forced error, that are outright winners, right? And if the other player is putting in less effort, he or she should concede more winners, and that would be sort of another way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, actually, our first approach was a little bit more in that direction. What we did then was to look at individual outcomes rather than point outcomes. Yeah, we should look at this. I mean, it's somewhere in these variables, in the sense that, like this fifth column here in that table here, basically is a variable that should measure or proxy a mean preserving spread, in the sense that you have two possible outcomes of risk taking. You either win, which would be an outright win in your sense, if you have a winner, if you have an ace or something like that, or you make a mistake, which would be the swing in the other direction. And we don't see anything going on there, but it would be nice, very rewarding potentially, to look at only one side of this argument. Yeah, thanks. That's very good. Yeah.
Ian.
So it's just a thought about the top quality players. So was I right that you didn't find an effect you didn't find a drop off in effort for the top quality matches? Is that right?
Exactly. If we look at the effect heterogeneity, if I find the slide, here it is. The match quality basically is measured by the fact here, in order to have a sample that is large enough, if both players are in the top 50, which is not really top match, so to speak, where everybody would go and watch, but it's still a very, very high quality match that you would expect to be competitive in any way, as long as both are healthy. Yeah.
So I wondered whether that was, the reason why you're an elite player is because you never give up. You always stick in the effort. You've done that regardless, all the way from when you were a teenager, when nobody was watching you play. So I just wonder whether that was a trait of a top quality player rather than like an immediate effect with actually everyone still watching them.
Yeah, that's an excellent explanation actually for why the split is happening. What also might play a role is the fact that if you are the lower ranked player, then you might be aware of the fact that the next day you will be in the newspapers being discussed as the opponent of this very high ranked player. And if you don't give full effort, then your sponsors will shy away and stuff like that. So you are committed to give effort by your opponent, so to speak. But your explanation is certainly in there as well. Certainly.
That actually reminds me of a talk I saw at a math sport conference years ago. I think it might have been Gordon Hunter was the author or someone else. And what they showed, they looked at essentially what you're looking at, the probability of winning a point. No, sorry, it wasn't quite. It was probability of winning the point if you'd lost the previous point.
Yeah.
And they showed that Djokovic, there was no difference. It didn't matter whether he'd won the last one or not. He just was the same, so he's kind of robotic, whereas everyone else was affected by losing the last point.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they always tell you, right? That's the old
saying. I actually think that's not true. I think it's the opposite. I think that the better players they're the ones who's going to dose their effort, and they're saying, why should I sort of, we can look at it, one can look at it, but I have a sense that that's not true. I think that better players are better because they play better all the time, not,
because of the,
yeah.
Any more questions and comments? Well, thank you, Mario. Thanks, everyone, for contributions. Really interesting paper, really interesting discussion as well. And I look forward to seeing where the paper appears in good time. So thanks for that, Mario. We'll break for the weekend. And next Friday, we will have Bernd Frick, who's presenting on gender differences again, which is nice, and the concentration of individual performance. And instead of tennis, it's evidence from track and field athletics. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Have a great weekend in the meantime.
Bye.